Hello, I'm excited to be here today to discuss Melody Ju's fabulous new book, Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater, which draws upon her experience of becoming a scuba diver to develop a theory of mediation specific to the ocean environment. I'm Courtney Berger, Executive Editor at Duke University Press, and I'm joined today by Melody, as well as Stacy Alimo, who is one of the editors of the new book series, Elements, which Melody's book is part of. Before we dive into questions, sorry, I had to include that pun, let me introduce our two guests. Melody Ju is Associate Professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and works across the fields of ocean humanities, science fiction, STS, and media theory. She is the author of Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater, as well as the co-editor with Rafico Ruiz of Saturation, forthcoming from Duke in 2021. And co-editor with Zach Glass and Jennifer Rhee of Informatics of Domination. Her new work explores the media of seaweeds in relation to photography, experimentation, and ecological infrastructure. Stacy Alimo is Professor of English and core faculty member in Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon. Her books include Undomesticated Ground, Recasting Nature as Feminist Space, Bodily Natures, Science, Environment, and the Material Self, and Exposed, Environmental Politics and Pleasures in Post-Human Times. She has edited two books, Material Feminisms and Matter, as well as a special volume of configurations on science studies and the blue humanities. She is currently writing a book entitled Deep Blue Ecologies, excuse me, Science, Aesthetics, and the Creatures of the Abyss. So I will ask the first question. Melody, can you tell us how you came to the project and what got you interested in thinking about media from an aquatic perspective?
Sure, thank you. So I had been interested in the ocean my whole life. Even as a young student, I remember being torn between majoring in marine biology and English, and I never could really decide which one. I eventually ended up pursuing English as a track. And it wasn't until my first year in grad school when the love for the ocean really came back. I was sort of disenchanted with my existing project and happened to be watching the Blue Planet documentary series by the BBC. And as soon as it hit the chapter on the deep ocean, David Attenborough has a memorable line about saying how there have been more people who have been into outer space than to the very bottom of the seafloor. And then the seafloor has all these strange alien creatures. And it was at that point that I realized that my interest in science fiction and the ocean were sort of natural companions to put together. And I thought, here's the beginning of something. Reading Stefan Helmrich's book, Alien Ocean, Anthropological Voyages and Microbial Seas was incredibly influential. And it was really proof for me that I could doing humanities work with the ocean, and informed by theory and STS in particular was possible. So that's what really got me going on thinking about the ocean. And then I had some encouragement from an advisor who said, you know, Melody, like if you really want to add a praxis element, you could pursue scuba diving training. And I thought, you're kidding. But of course, this was because I was coming from more of a background in literary studies and not anthropology, where sort of venturing into the field is a lot more common. And so then once I got into scuba diving as a sort of mode of embodied experience, that gave me a lot to think about in relation to the literature and media that I was exploring and reading, most notably Willem Flusser's strange media fable on the vampire squid. And that was really that became chapter 2 in the book. But working on that initially as an article for Grey Room was sort of my first foray into thinking about the materiality of the ocean, about its role in rethinking media, and about the ocean really as this cognitive environment to press up against and think with.
Awesome.
So there's a lot of things I want to come back to in what you just said, especially about the alien. But for now, I wanted to ask, since your book is appearing as part of the Elements series, what does the elemental mean for you? And why is this an important concept to think with? And does thinking with the elemental change or shift methodologies, perspectives, theories, topics? Like, what does that entail? Maybe how would the book have been different if it weren't thinking with the elemental?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's hard to think about the ocean without thinking of the elemental, just because there's so many cultural resonances with the ocean as an origin, as a milieu, and fundamentally as a space of seawater plus lots of other things that are involved. So it was sort of it was a natural fit for the elements, but where this really comes in the book is in thinking about the elements for whom. So I think there's a maybe tendency when you first think about elements to maybe imagine the periodic table or to imagine something internal and non-changing. And those resonances are still there and I think can come up in interesting ways. But in the case of the ocean, I think its qualities as an element really depend on for whom. And that's where the sea creatures come in as really important interlocutors to think with. So for example, the anoxic zone is a really nice habitable space for the vampire squid, or not anoxic, but the low oxic zone, which is a couple hundred feet under the sea. The vampire squid loves it. This is a great home for it. But it's not such a great home for something else that needs a lot more light. And so the nature of seawater and the ocean as an element to live in, also an element with certain chemical and physical properties, really depends on this for whom question. And that's what gets me into, I think, more of the speculative and science fictional territory in oceanic thinking, because you're always sort of adjusting your expectations about what something is based on the embodied observer that's encountering it. And so here I draw a lot of inspiration from feminist science studies, particularly work from people like Donna Haraway and thinking about situated knowledge. And so the ocean, for me, is really the space where you have to think about situatedness and in relation to the elementality of the ocean. I think that let's see, had the book not appeared in the Element series, maybe those qualities of seawater wouldn't have sort of popped quite as much. Maybe it would have been read sort of more strictly media theory and STS. But I think the Elements really highlight something about the environmental qualities of the book that aren't just taking the environment as a background, but something that suffuses where perception is coming from, either for me as a scuba diver or for some creature that's experiencing life in the ocean.
I'll follow up on that. So you describe the book as milieu-specific analysis, thinking through seawater. I'm wondering, how does media look different underwater? How does the milieu kind of change the way that you're thinking about media?
Sure. So I think a good example of this is the famous sculptures by Jason DeCaires Taylor. So he has a number of underwater sculptures designed to change over time. And I think that one thing media theory largely has to some extent, but largely hasn't taken sort of stock of is media that are a little bit more ephemeral or passing, rather than this vocabulary that's really attuned to computational media. So inscription, storage, processing, and how things get preserved over time. Once you turn into this, questions about environmental media, ephemerality, I think, comes in a lot more strongly. And one could look to sculptures like Jason DeCaires Taylor's work, which involve these often human figures that are sunken underwater and made of a substance that allows all these different sea creatures to grow on them. And so they evoke all kinds of imaginaries, from Proteus to different kinds of sunken bodies, and those are not sort of about permanency and storage as unchanging, but really they're really more about change over time. So I guess when I think about how media are different in the ocean. It's not just the media themselves, but really the vocabulary that we use, the conceptual vocabulary we use to talk about media in the first place. So the book is actually structured around this premise. Each chapter takes a concept in media theory and imagines how is this different underwater. So another example of this is rethinking interface. So in my interface chapter, I think through how is the interface not just a sort of something like a screen or an interface that, like a mouse that allows for control on part of the user. Instead, I think about what if the human lungs and scuba diving are a kind of interface? What are the implications for thinking about the interface then? And these have a lot more to do with temporariness, duration, and time, because when you go scuba diving underwater, you can't stay there forever, even if you had this unlimited oxygen supply. So there's a lot of concern for that, a lot of concern for how you as an interface feel based on how your ears are doing, how your lungs are doing, how cold you are, and just other factors that determine how long you're going to hang out underwater. So in that case, I felt that it was inadequate to only base theories of interface on computational media and screen cultures, or even thinking of interfaces as effects. Once you shift to the body, I think there's all these other questions that come up, but it's the body in relation to the ocean. So this was sort of an amphibious chapter, not one that was about how is a particular sea creature experiencing interface, but you can start to ask other questions about that too. So those are some thoughts there.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the interface a little bit. I really loved all your accounts of scuba diving in the book, your own accounts of diving, and then also your readings of, say, Sylvia Earle's description of diving as becoming and being a kind of interface, an embodied being as interface. And I thought that was really beautifully done. And then I really like your idea, too, of diving as a method of cognitive estrangement that shows us our terrestrial biases. And so I'm wondering how you see the relationship between diving or other immersive experiences and a kind of development of an ethical or political orientation toward the ocean. I mean, in some ways, those things seem very far apart. I mean, a very personal, immersive, embodied, tactile kind of experience of being this interface or other ways that you see being in the ocean. But then how does that extend to a kind of conservation ethics or animal ethics towards sea creatures or something else? And then the second part of that would be, do you think that if there is something there that's distinctive in terms of inspiring or inciting a kind of ethical or political orientation or the beginnings of that, is there a way of media, what we see is what people who are not in media studies, material media studies, like would see as media, like films or literature or something else? Is there a way that that can be captured and conveyed, or is it just sort of impossible to pull that through in a way that is compelling? I mean, the experience of diving is so completely its own world. It's hard to think of, say, a film about it really capturing it. So kind of two parts there.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll maybe answer this in reverse order. So one thing I've thought a lot about is again, like what's the sort of political or ethical influence or efficacy of different types of media about the ocean, and what can they really do? I think that we're really in for a kind of long haul project with the creation of any media about the ocean. And it's hard when we want to see change more immediately, but it's a different kind of project to think about shifting a kind of cultural affect or orientation towards something like care of the ocean. Because these media, they're not like, for example, watching Blue Planet or watching Chasing Coral. Maybe they'll inspire something, but it's not going to be a kind of behavioral change, or think about this with my grad students who want to see science fiction as doing some kind of important world building work. I think it's a lot slower. It's not going to be a kind of immediate change. But I think that the more contact one has with thinking about the ocean, either in person or through these different kinds of media, one of the really valuable lessons is actually one about humility. And I think it's just generally a really, really healthy ethical or other orientation to have to think so much about how limited your own sensorium and your own abilities to perceive are in this milieu that you aren't particularly well attuned for. And that's what I learned through scuba diving. So when, there's the phrase fish out of water, but if you flip that, it's the human plunked into the water for maybe the first time. Like, I think we can all think back to, there's those who aren't swimmers, and even those who are, if you think back to your earlier memories of learning to play in the water, it's a process. You have to get used to it. And as a scuba diver, I have some very strong memories of just how terrestrial I felt when I first put on the apparatus, felt like a turtle because there's this huge thing on your back, and then jumped in the ocean. And there's different sort of, norms for how you're supposed to dive. And there's a kind of streamlined horizontal posture that you're really encouraged to adopt. But every time I felt out of control, the one thing I did was flip on my feet because I wanted the security of my feet underneath me. And then also, as a diver, you have this huge mask on. And if you start thinking about just how different your experience, even with all this equipment, is from different kinds of sea creatures that do things like smell underwater, have electrosensitivity, or use echolocation like whales and dolphins to sense different things. It's really quite a limited, you're working from really quite a limited perspective. So I think that humility is really important in a couple things. One, I think that it gives us this better sense of being part of a larger ecology. I also think it can help science ask better questions, rather than assuming that human objectivity is sort of the standard. Becoming more aware of our predispositions, I think, can help in experiment design, or being aware of how different instruments are maybe sensing something and then communicating or transducing that into a format that's perceivable for us. So like in sound studies, you might use a hydrophone not to just hear sound underwater, you would watch it as a spectrograph. And that's how a lot of scientists working with whales and dolphins work. And so these are very sort of general soft points, but I think that overall, the dimension of humility just felt really important for me. And that was inspired a lot by the work of Sylvia Earle, and then also becoming a diver too. So Sylvia, who is this fantastic ocean activist, has spent thousands and thousands of hours underwater. And she talks about this concept of fathoming the ocean, which is actually based on this etymology where fathom means the embrace of arms, and that was measured at 6 feet, or like a standard man's embrace. So that's an artifact from the OED that, maybe not quite feminist, but like at least in its aspirations kind of is. So for her, fathoming or knowing the ocean is about this kind of measured embrace. And I thought that was just a really wonderful figure to think with about epistemics that the ocean can teach us.
One thing I really love about everything that you've said today so far is that you have this kind of oscillation between a kind of embodied, immersive approach of the human, and then estranging us from that into this not terrestrial but oceanic sense of the elemental, but that is always interconnected with a kind of multi-species vision. I think that that's really a strong part of your ethics running through there. And I like how the two keep kind of being separate and then merging. There's sort of these waves of the multi-species perspective lives. And then that's what kind of deterritorializes the human in a way. Yeah, just wanted to throw that in there.
Oh, that's a lovely comment. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, I found your descriptions of scuba diving useful because you really highlight the way in which our experience of a water environment, for example, is already highly mediated through all of this equipment. And that, you know, that approach just highlights the mediation of our relationship to the environment.
Yeah, one thing I learned from Stefan Helmrich from a different article he had shared is that you can think of that mediation even at the level of goggles and the evolution of the human eye, because if you start to go back a little further, the eye needs to be moisturized, and it also crucially needs a pocket of air in order to focus. And so that's what the goggles give you, is that extra pocket so that you can see underwater well. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of Stefan Helmreich, I'm a big fan of his Alien Ocean book. I think it's just an absolutely brilliant book. It's so beautifully written and it's magnificent. But I've kind of been a critic of the trope of the ocean as alien. Yes, insofar as it circulates through popular culture. It is a very common trope to see ocean creatures as aliens. And for me, one of the issues is that it makes the ocean another world in often not a good way, because then it's beyond the terrain of human concern and environmental concern and politics and care. All of those terms that you'd want to throw in there. It's just this separate entity with these weird, strange creatures, and we can marvel at it, but we don't have to take any responsibility for them. We don't have to really be concerned for them because they're just doing their thing somewhere else. And we're in a completely separate world from they are, since they're so alien. So what do you think about that figure of the alien? What does it do in a positive sense? Do you see limitations of it? Is that something that you've been thinking of with the book?
Yeah, definitely. So I think what was useful about Stefan's book is that he named a cultural phenomenon. All right, well, I'm not sure if phenomenon is quite the right word. He named something that recurs in culture so frequently that now we can at least have the terminology to identify it. So, for example, if you go to the aquarium, just think about the framing and the narratives that hook you into the exhibit about jellyfish or cephalopods, so octopi or octopuses, squids, etc. It's just for the folks writing and displaying and exhibiting these creatures, it's just such a convenient hook, and we see it over and over. So anyway, so I felt that Alien Ocean was useful in being able to quickly name what was going on and this phenomena. But at the same time, that's, of course, you're absolutely right. This is not the only relation we can have with sea creatures. And something I've learned from my colleague Tess Shuri, who specializes in indigenous Pacific literatures, is that in other cultures, the ocean can be an ancestral home and coded really differently. So if you think of sharks as hosting the spirits of your ancestors, that models a really different relationality to the ocean, one that I would think drifts a lot more close to care and concern rather than something like fear and the uncanny, which is a lot more common in Western philosophy. So I think that the first step maybe is just learning to see alternatives, but I don't think it's limited necessarily to the alien and the familiar or the kin necessarily. I mean, there's lots of other kind of examples you can take from science fiction that maybe hover somewhere in between. So Europa Report, taking a marine biologist into outer space to be able to more identify different forms of life out there, even though that also takes the form of a kind of suspense film. Yeah, so I think that, the alien ideally shouldn't be limiting, but can help us diagnose a tendency that we commonly do see. I think you can also say the opposite though too, that the human often may feel alien in the ocean environment. But again, that too has to be qualified by cultural familiarity and how much time one spends in the water. So one thing that I try to distinguish in the book is that even though lots of people around the world have differing degrees of familiarity with the ocean, the one thing we all share in common though is the need to surface for air. And so that I think puts an interesting constraint on sort of the way we think about amphibiousness and contact with the ocean and humans in the ocean. There's still this need to breathe no matter how aquatic people might drift in their life practices, from sailing to pearl diving to fishing and other things. But at least for me, learning to dive was definitely an exercise in estrangement and the just valuation of up and down and what buoyancy means and how to actually be neutrally buoyant, which means hang out in the water column and not try to drift up or down. And like that's the mark of a really experienced diver that I'm still attempting to approximate, but I still admire in those who spent all the hours accumulated needed to really be comfortable with that.
So do you want to talk about any new directions that you see in the ocean humanities or media studies or media and the environment, other things that you're interested that you see happening now?
Sure. So I don't know about in the field as a whole. I mean, it's been a bit of a, the COVID experience has sort of changed things. I hope we just all have a lot of time for maybe reading where we didn't before. I will say that Wild Blue Media very much feels like a pre-COVID book because it takes for granted that people may have access to the ocean or different kinds of immersion. One thing I was hoping that the book would do is also be applicable to thinking about milieu, not just in terms of the ocean, but also maybe like ice or glacial environments or mangroves, and like how embodied orientation feels in those spaces, and what different kinds of milieu, not just the ocean, can do to rethink rethink things that we've taken for granted in the humanities on a conceptual level. In terms of my own new work, I felt myself drifting towards thinking about seaweeds, in part because I work at UC Santa Barbara and they're not that far away. But that's been provoking some other thinking for me, not just on seaweeds as a kind of photosynthesizing media form, but I've been thinking a lot about metabolism and Hannah Landecker's work on metabolism as something for the humanities to think with. It taps right into these questions about what is life, but also is not just about, I think, ecology as relation. It's about transformation on a key level, and it takes place over time. So I've been thinking about seaweeds in relation to this kind of stretching provided by a concept of metabolism, as seaweeds in various ways are extracted into things that we use for foods. The extract agar actually comes from a seaweed, and agar is fundamental in petri dishes. And so you could say that seaweeds actually underlie so many practices of culturing bacteria in science. And there's a way, if you sort of follow this materialist analysis, which I know Stacy has thought about a lot too, the seaweeds actually underlie a lot in food and also in these scientific and industrial purposes. And so this has me thinking about, seaweeds in this way that's sort of fueling a global metabolism and also knowledge production. If again, you think about the seaweed as the seaweed extract being in a petri dish. I've also seen some interest in seaweeds come up in discussions of climate cuisine and eating as well. So how might seaweeds be a kind of low impact food to raise, because you don't fertilize them, you just attach them to some hard substrate or a string or rope, like out in the, I guess line would be the appropriate word for any sailors listening here, a line out in the ocean, and you don't have to fertilize or add any extra inputs. So I've seen them come up in that respect as well. So some of the new directions I'm curious about have to do with this. Although at my own university, I've seen so much interest in infrastructure, multiple classes and graduate student projects all thinking about infrastructure in some kind of way. So I feel like in some way, a lot of the new work is prompting questioning around things that support like ecological or environmental things that support our existence broadly, and considering how infrastructure thinking might inform those. In California, we've been having some rolling blackouts because it's really hot right now, and there's been a lot of high demand on the energy grid. And so I have a student who's sort of thinking about phenomena like this. So in a general sense, I feel a drift towards thinking infrastructure. I'm not sure how this will end up with the seaweed question or not, but right now they're sort of my companion species that I try to make time to go see.
Really fascinating new work. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to ask you. Wild Blue Media was your first book, and I am just wondering if there are any lessons you took away from writing this book that might inform your writing moving forward, or that maybe changed your writing process?
That's a great question. You know, I think just maybe giving up on the fantasy that a book could ever be written in a linear way. There was a lot of shuffling. I mean, this was the product. This was my graduate dissertation, but it took a long time to put together. I guess just patience with my own writing process and being okay with beginning with fragments. I think giving yourself that permission is really, really helpful from an early stage, and knowing that it's just going to go through drafts and drafts and drafts. One thing I did learn too in shaping this up from a form of graduate writing to the book is also to think about authorial voice in a different sort of way. And so one of the big overhauls I did between an earlier draft and the final manuscript was adding so much more framing language and thinking about maybe a target audience of a first or second year grad student in a field that was not mine, and imagining them as an interlocutor and trying to move a lot more slowly with the argument and the language to be able to allow them to follow in a smooth sort of way. So a lot of the work on the book was really thinking about sort of teaching the research at that level. So hopefully I'll bring some of those lessons learned to future work. I mean, it's just been really exciting also, Courtney, to work with you on multiple projects now. So I'm excited about Saturation and Elemental Politics coming out, which is the edited collection you mentioned. Also in the Element series with Stacy, and hopefully seeing that in print next year.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you, Stacy and Melody, for joining us for this conversation. And if you want to learn more about Wild Blue Media, you can go to our website and also check out the other books in the Element series. Thank you.
Thank you.